All right, good morning, everyone. Before we start, I want to let everyone know that we have a French and Farsi interpretation option this morning. I believe there's a little globe icon on the bottom of your screen if you want to access that. All right. Well, good morning. I'm so happy you chose to join me this morning. My name is Laura Hankins, and I am the instructional specialist for reading intervention and dyslexia in Montgomery County Public Schools. I'm new to this position this year. Prior to this position, I was a school-based reading specialist at Gaithersburg Elementary for many, many years. It was that work that prompted me to go back to school and study dyslexia, which led me to the science of reading research and the research on how all children learn to read. Most of my work this year has been working with the elementary ELA department in service of using the science of reading to shift literacy instruction in Montgomery County Public Schools to a structured literacy approach, one that is aligned with their research. This shift will best serve all students while also being essential for students with dyslexia. I also teach as an adjunct instructor at the University of Maryland and at Shepherd University. I'm really excited to be here today, provide some information and spread awareness about the brain difference that is dyslexia. Before we get started, I'd love to know who's here. So please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know if you're a parent or educator or both. And if you want to offer more information than that, that would be great. Feel free to do so.
Oh, hello. My name is Sonia Sen. I have a daughter who has autism and dyslexia, and I'm actually looking to for more opportunities for her with with dyslexia, because that's really her main focus when she's in school. And most people and most of her educators focus on the autism part, and I really want to engage them with this dyslexia, where I want to be able to help her more. And she's in the 10th grade. So that's probably late now to try to get that on board. But that's it. Thank you. Sorry.
Sure. No, thank you for unmuting and letting me know why you're here. That's great to hear. I see that there's a lot from what I can see, most people here so far. We have a French immersion teacher, but we also have parents of students with dyslexia, some secondary so far. Okay, and other educators. So great, thank you for introducing yourself. It always helps to have some context. There is a portion of today that is interactive. I'm hoping when we get to that part that we can unmute, put your cameras on, because it'll just be a lot more engaging if everyone participates. If not, it might fall flat a little bit. So I'm hoping everybody will do that. It'll be, probably, after we talk a little bit about what dyslexia is and all of that. So, all right, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so today I plan to address these questions. I realize many of you, as you introduce yourselves, have a child with dyslexia, and some of you are special educators or general educators who have or have had many students with dyslexia. My main objective today is to create a shared awareness about dyslexia so that this special population of students might find more support in schools and in general. Let's start with what is dyslexia. Dyslexia is a brain difference. We can divide the morphemes in the word dyslexia. Dys is the Greek root for bad, lex means printed words, and ik means having the character of or form of, while ia means condition. So dyslexia literally means condition of bad word reading. It is characterized as a word level reading impairment. Just for purposes of engagement, I'm gonna throw it out there. Would anyone be willing to unmute and read this definition of dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association?
Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge.
Thank you so much. Roya, I think it was. Thank you for unmuting and reading that so beautifully for us and modeling this miraculous task of fluent reading that many of us, it comes easy to many of us and it does not for all. Dyslexia impacts 10 to 20% of all people. Most camps believe it's closer to 20% due to how many people are believed to never have been diagnosed. Though some experts in the field say as few as 5%, as dyslexia is a spectrum disorder and the highly impacted percentage of the population is fewer. Dyslexia accounts for 80% of specific learning disabilities. It's the most common learning disability. This definition is the most agreed upon definition, but dyslexia can be difficult to define, and we're going to talk about why that is. Dyslexia is a localized weakness within a very specific component of the language system in the brain, the phonological module, the area of the brain where sounds of spoken language are put together to form words. Most people with dyslexia struggle to appreciate the internal structure of words. For some, this struggle might even sometimes come out in their speech. You might hear eminy for enemy, or specific for specific, or ossifer for officer. These confusions are most common in multisyllabic words, but not all people with dyslexia make those speech confusions. But this phonological core deficit, it impacts the person with dyslexia's ability to process the visual code to represent the speech sounds. Dyslexia is a hardship, mostly because our society is so rooted in text, and learning to read is essential for navigating today's society. And so having a struggle with a skill so essential to daily life, it is a hardship and a challenge for sure. Being a brain difference, people with dyslexia often have heightened abilities in other areas and are often deemed superior to the typical brain. So while a hardship for sure, the brain difference does often, not always, afford many some special talents that can sadly often go unrecognized. Dyslexia, as I mentioned, is a spectrum disorder, which simply means that the disability varies in level of impact. Dyslexia is part of what we call neurodiversity. Having a spectrum disorder really just means that your brain is a little or a lot different from what we deem a typical brain function. Spectrum disorders are tricky to identify because there's no one black and white definition to identify it. It's not like identifying a vision or a hearing impairment. There's no one dyslexia test that one can pass or fail, though I hear researchers are working on developing one for sure. There are shared characteristics of dyslexia, but no two people with dyslexia present exactly in the same way. Dyslexia is identified by recognizing a pattern or cluster of behaviors and characteristics. We can confirm dyslexia with an fMRI, where we can see the common patterns in the brain of one with dyslexia, but we certainly do not need an fMRI to identify dyslexia. You may have heard that dyslexia requires a medical diagnosis. That is not true. Dyslexia is neurobiological, but it can be identified by the recognition of common characteristics, deficits, behaviors, just like other learning disabilities. As dyslexia is neurobiological, it does run in families. When we suspect dyslexia, schools need to be asking about family history when collecting information. If one has a parent or both parents or a sibling with dyslexia, the likelihood increases significantly. One can have dyslexia without a family history, for sure, but there is a genetic trend. Brain imaging technology shows us exactly what's happening when a fluent reader reads, as well as the brain changes that occur when a beginning reader learns to read. This imaging shows us that multiple areas of the brain are utilized to achieve reading comprehension. Reading is a relatively new human invention, a brilliant one that's elevated our species in immeasurable ways, but only a part of our existence for about 3% of the time humans have been on Earth. Our species hasn't had time to evolve to make a reading brain part of any sort of natural ability. Reading and learning to read is not natural, like learning to speak, which humans have been doing forever. Every individual must create a reading brain for themselves by repurposing and recycling areas of the brain evolved for other things. This conversion comes easily for some, requires explicit instruction for most, and some are going to struggle with it always. For efficient, fluent readers, most of the activity for reading is on the left side and in 3 different lobes, in the front, middle, and back of the brain. Speech, sounds, and phonology up front in the frontal lobe, language comprehension in the middle, which is the auditory cortex meant for processing oral language, not printed. And the area that translates the visual symbols into sounds and meaning is in the back. That back area, the visual cortex, is the area of the brain wired for object and face recognition. And there's another area of the brain on the right and left called the angular gyrus that translates the sound symbol connections to semantic processing, meaning. The white matter in the brain is the matter that makes pathways between these regions. Neurotypical brains, while reading, they have white matter pathways that looks like a well-designed highway system, as if it was strategically placed there to make travel between lobes efficient and quick. When a child learns to read, they're developing each one of those lobes while creating white matter pathways to help these 4 areas of the brain communicate with each other. The quality of reading instruction absolutely impacts a child's lobe development and white matter development. When a fluent reader reads, they take the visual stimulus, the letters off the page, translate those graphemes, the individual letters or combinations of letters that represent each sound, to the phonemes, the individual sounds of a language, to create words we recognize and then interpret those words to mean something. This all happens in milliseconds, so it feels as if we are reading by sight and sight alone, but we are not. Humans employ these 3 distinct lobes of the brain every time they read and use that angular gyrus to interpret the written code to spoken language. So if that's what happens in a neurotypical fluent reader brain, what happens in the brains of people with dyslexia that make reading so difficult? Thanks to the science of reading and understanding the areas of the brain that are involved in reading and the activity of the brains of fluent readers, scientists have been able to compare that imaging with the activity of the brains with people with dyslexia. Dyslexia impacts the ability to learn to read and read fluently. This is an image of the left side of the brain of a neurotypical reader and a reader with dyslexia. In the brain of a person with dyslexia, the activity takes place predominantly on the right hemisphere, which we're not seeing here, instead of on the left, and the frontal lobe for phonological processing, as well as the occipital lobe in the back for the interpretation of visual symbols, they don't activate in the same way. The brain of someone with dyslexia processes the visual input on the right side, hardly fires the phonological lobe to interpret those visuals to speech sounds, and jumps to the language comprehension lobe on the left. The white matter and the pathways are much longer as the information is traveling from right to left of the sides of the brain, crossing hemispheres. This makes reading much more difficult. People with dyslexia are not attaching these letters and combinations of letters to sounds, and they're jumping from printed word to language comprehension, sometimes without the sounds. People with dyslexia work so much harder to read than do their typical peers. It is cruelly ironic that students with dyslexia are often accused of not trying hard enough or being lazy, not applying themselves. They are actually working so much harder. Their brains are working very inefficiently for reading. And that highway system between lobes is not efficient or quick. That is dyslexia. It's a brain difference. In a neurotypical emergent reader, there's a progressive disengagement of the right hemisphere and increasing engagement of the left hemisphere as they learn to read. This shift that is not something that happens naturally for children with dyslexia. Their right hemisphere remains dominant and therefore less efficient for reading. This can change for students with the right kind of instruction and the needed intensity and duration of instruction. It's going to take a lot more and a lot more practice to truly change the wiring of the brain and the function and the areas of the brain. But reading will, and students with dyslexia can learn to read, but reading will likely always be hard work. There are two major differences or deficits of the brains of people with dyslexia are phonological processing, which is the processing of the sounds of language, and processing speed. People with dyslexia process language differently regarding input and output, and they have a great deal of trouble recognizing that internal structure of words, the phonemes. This impacts their ability to learn the graphemes, the letters and combinations of letters that represent those sounds. It also impacts their ability to appreciate the sequence of sounds in words, therefore the sequence in spellings. The other difference addresses processing speed, but not all processing speed for sure. People with dyslexia can be very quick to process some kinds of information. It is not a deficit in all processing speed. It's specific to what's called naming speed. Naming speed is the speed it takes to take a visual stimulus and connect it with vocabulary or a word or a name. They can be slower to connect a visual stimulus to language. And as I spoke about, the paths in the brain of one with dyslexia are different, and it takes longer to name objects and certainly letters and sounds. This is what impacts fluency for students with dyslexia that do eventually learn the code for reading. About 80% of people with dyslexia have a phonological processing deficit. And about 80% of people with dyslexia have a naming deficit or timing issue. So if you do the math, about 60% have both. These students are described as having double deficit, and these students are going to have the hardest time with learning to read. But remember, dyslexia is a spectrum disorder, which means it varies in level of impact. So a deficit in either of these areas could be mild or severe. A person could have a severe phonological deficit and a very mild or no naming deficit. And a person could have no phonological deficit and a significant naming speed deficit. Any individual with dyslexia could have any combination on the spectrum. And that's why there is no one and only dyslexic profile. Oh, see, I ruined it. I clicked too early. I wanted to ask the group, before we start dispelling some myths about dyslexia, what in the chat or unmute, what do you think are the most common misunderstandings about dyslexia?
I think you were right when you said that kids with dyslexia are often labeled as you're not trying hard enough.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Or they can't read. Thank you. They're not smart. Mm-hmm. I'd see, I'm noticing a question in the chat right now about fMRI. It's a functional, that's the functional brain imaging technology where you can watch the activity in the brain. So
I saw on the slide, but it said about a vision problem because they reversed the P's and the B's and all of that. And I've also heard about conversions of the eyes, but I'm just learning.
okay. Thank you for putting these in the chat. Yes, that's a very, very common one. Usually the one most people say is that, yeah, people with dyslexia see things backwards, or they see letters backwards.
Or they start reading a word with the last letter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So let's talk about that, because that, again, that's that confusion of the internal structure of words and sequences. Okay, so yes, let's dispel some of the myths that you've probably heard before. That people with dyslexia cannot learn to read. People with dyslexia can and do learn to read, but they need the right kind of instruction to do it. Dyslexia is never cured or removed, but people with dyslexia absolutely can learn to read. They estimate 2 to 5% of people with dyslexia, even with intense and appropriate instruction, will not reach levels to be regarded as functionally literate at adult levels, but most students can learn to read. It's not a vision problem. People with dyslexia do not see anything backwards. It is true that many, not all, but many will often struggle with mirror imaging with a BDP, or they'll say was for saw. But it is not due to seeing anything different on the page. Sequences can be challenging for students with dyslexia. This is true with phonemes and graphemes as well. They don't see anything backwards. They might misinterpret the sequence. They also have a phonological processing deficit that affects their appreciation of that structure, internal structure of sound in words. So some people with dyslexia struggle to decode visual symbols accurately and quickly. And for some, their naming speed is slower. So the letters that look similar are more difficult. Remember, they're using a different part of their brain to process the letters, which isn't necessarily sensitive to orientation. A ball and a stick is the same picture, whichever way it's positioned. We call them reversals, but they are likely just confusions. Their brains are taking an alternate neurological route to connect that letter with its appropriate sound or name. It takes them longer, and sometimes they don't allow themselves the time to process the information, and they guess, which makes it appear to us as though they're seeing a different letter or a word. But their vision is fine. They need more processing time and practice. This third one, by definition, dyslexia is a reading impairment that is unexpected in people with average to above average intelligence. Poor readers with low IQ often struggle with some of the same components of reading, and there are conflicting opinions about whether poor readers with low IQ have dyslexia or they are poor readers due to comorbid variables. It is actually very common for people to have average and often very high superior intelligence. I mentioned before, that not all people with dyslexia have that phonological core deficit. 20 to 30% of students with dyslexia will score in average ranges in phonological processing tests. These are the single deficit students who will likely struggle with naming speed. And these students don't usually appear to struggle with reading until about the 3rd grade because they learn the code okay. Not all do, but the timing delay between visual language center that impacts that development of their sight word vocabularies. So this affects their development of automaticity. What these students likely will not score well on is something called a RAN-RAS test. It's rapid automatized naming, rapid alternating stimulus tests that assess their ability to retrieve vocabulary quickly from a visual symbol. These students who can decode okay will present as very dysfluent while reading. They may decode accurately, but do not acquire that sight word vocabulary at the same rate as their non-dyslexic peers. And that's why they present so dysfluent. They have to stop to decode often. This lack of fluency will likely impact their comprehension of text. Dyslexia does not only impact reading. Dyslexia can impact language processing, articulation of words, and especially spelling and writing. ADHD and executive functioning disorders often accompany dyslexia. Some think that dyslexia is the reading disability and dysgraphia is the writing disability. But the truth is, if a student does not struggle with the formation of letters, that automatic fluency of forming and writing letters, they don't have dysgraphia. If a student reads fairly well, has no trouble forming letters with a pencil, but struggles terribly with spelling, that can be dyslexia. That's impacted by not understanding the internal structure of words. This is a great example of the nature of the spectrum nature of the disorder. Also, students with dyslexia often struggle with math. Memorization tasks are sometimes really challenging or impossible. Many will not memorize basic facts like their times tables. No amount of practice on flashcards are going to help them to do this. Rote memorization of any facts can, for some, be impossible if they have this brain difference. It's not an effective approach to learning facts. Often, people with dyslexia are weak in mental math, but very strong in conceptual math. So we should give them a calculator. Those facts are unnecessary for success in high-level math. It's a giant misunderstanding that memorization of math facts is essential for math proficiency. It just isn't. And this last one, nationwide in public schools, dyslexia is most often identified after 3rd grade, sometimes not until high school or adulthood. But the truth is that dyslexia can be identified in kindergarten and maybe even sometimes earlier. New research is coming out, even before students typically learn letters, because we can identify naming speed and we can identify phonological core deficit. Early intervention can prevent serious reading problems. It can't prevent dyslexia, as that is neurobiological, but it can prevent the severity of symptoms. Most states, like Maryland included, have recently passed legislation to screen all kindergartners and 1st graders for dyslexia and/or risk for reading failure, so that intervention instruction can be provided when it is most effective at the earliest grades. A screener is a tool to identify risk. It is not an identification tool. A quality screener would include a one-on-one assessment with a skilled teacher that assesses phonemic awareness, letter naming, letter sounds, nonsense word fluency, and a RAN-RAS test that's been normed across all different populations of kids. When teachers know how to respond when a student shows characteristics of risk for reading failure in kindergarten and 1st grade, additional instruction can be provided, and many of these students will do well. When students don't respond to this kind of instruction, and we'll talk about that in a second, where they don't improve, then that's an indicator for more assessment, and that intensity and duration of intervention instruction likely needs to be increased. MCPS is using the DIBLS 8th assessment for their dyslexia screener next year. Here are just some of the common characteristics of dyslexia. I see somebody wants, does someone want to ask a question?
Yeah, just quickly about that. Do we have to do the phonemic awareness in the native language? Let's say we have Russian speakers or Spanish speakers, or because I don't think these tests exist in those languages. So if we're testing a kindergartner in English and they've spoken Russian at home all day, or Chinese or Spanish, how is that a valid?
You are absolutely right. And ideally, we would test all students in their native language. But you're also absolutely right that we don't have tools in all the languages. So if you're testing a student who is not a native English speaker with an English assessment, that needs to be considered, because a lot of a lot of non-native English speakers are going to do poorly on an English assessment. And it could just simply be that it's not their native language. So like you said, it's a risk. We need to look through that lens and consider that as a variable, and then try to see if we want more information about that student to see what else we can collect and keep a careful eye. But that's absolutely true. Lots of our emerging multilingual learners perform poorly on these screeners, and they're not at risk for reading failure. They just need time to learn the language. Excellent. Thank you for asking that question. So here are some on the slide, some of the characteristics, and all students with dyslexia are going to have trouble learning to read, and most are poor spellers even into adulthood. Most have weak phonological processing skills. Many have slow processing speed, and they just need more time. It does not look the same for every student or adult with dyslexia. Some of the difference has to do with the type of instruction that they get. And some of the difference is just the nature of being a spectrum disorder. If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we can teach the way they learn. This is the kind of type of instruction needed for all students to learn to read, but certainly for students with dyslexia. Students require systematic, explicit, and cumulative instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics. This should be in place for all students in K-2, and some students with dyslexia, those on the more mild end of the spectrum, they can learn just fine with that. MCPS will have that in place. I can't help but smile. We will have that in place next year for all students in their tier 1 instruction in K-2. This will not be enough for all students with dyslexia. They will require more intense and more small group instruction that allows for additional practice and decoding and spelling, and likely need a lot more time. Still, the systematic, explicit, and cumulative piece, it's extremely important. Okay, so here we're at the portion of our time together that I'm hoping for a little bit of participation. And this is going to take some cooperation. But before we start, what I'd like to engage you all in is a simulation today. But before we do, we've got to talk about what a simulation is and what it is not. Simulation comes from the Dyslexia Training Institute, and it's built with the utmost respect for the dyslexic community. We're going to engage in one of the 5 simulations that DTI provides. Brain differences are hard to understand, and these simulations are designed to create a level of frustration and cognitive demand for those of us who are not dyslexic that simulates the experience of a person with dyslexia reading regular text. They are not meant to create an exact example of what a person with dyslexia experiences. They're meant to create understanding and empathy. If the text is modified, it is not to imply that jumbled text is what someone with dyslexia actually sees. The modified stimulus in these simulations are meant to create an environment or experience for folks with neurotypical brains. I recently heard an analogy that a simulation of dyslexia and living with dyslexia is the same as the difference between a 100-yard run and a marathon. There is no way someone who has run 100 yards can imagine or experience what it's like to run a marathon. Again, these simulations are designed to approximate parts of the experience for a person with dyslexia. I also want to emphasize that there is no single dyslexia experience. Like we spoke about earlier, it's a spectrum disorder. There is no unitary condition. And I really want to be respectful of the dyslexia community and recognize that many people with dyslexia don't like these simulations because it isn't often made clear by the facilitator that the modified stimulus is not at all consistent with having dyslexia. So to be clear, that modified stimulus is to create an experience for fluent readers that they couldn't experience otherwise. So we're going to engage in a little practice that dominates most classrooms nationwide, in all content areas, except for maybe in math, popcorn reading or round robin reading. But it's going to take some cooperation of all of us here. Let's see. So I'm going to put 2 links in the chat. If your last name begins with A through H, I'd like you to open this first link I'm putting in the chat. Only if your last name begins with A through H. Okay, and if your last name begins with I through Z, I'd like you to grab this second link in the chat, only the second link at the chat. A little harder to do virtually than in person, but we can do it. So go ahead and grab your text, and I hope everybody is ready to participate. I'm going to call randomly on folks to read aloud this article. So please unmute if I call your name. Please follow along in your text, as you won't know when I'm going to be calling on you. I'm going to use calling sticks. That's another popular practice in a lot of classrooms for random calling of students to choose people to read. And here we go. Okay, let's see. Let's start with someone I can see who's ready to go. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Roya, would you start reading aloud? Thank you, Roya.
Okay. Unfortunately, the word dyslexia has been used, abused, and misused throughout the years, which has teachers, administrators, and school psychologists reluctant to use the word. But dyslexia does have an agreed upon definition, and there are specific symptoms associated with dyslexia. Should I keep going?
Sure, a little bit.
Okay. The bottom line is that it does exist no matter what name people give it, i.e. specific learning disability, etc. In fact, according to Sally Shaywitz, 2003, its prevalence is actually 1 in 5 children, which is 20%. Dyslexia, in the simplest terms, is a difficulty with phonological processing that makes it challenging to decode words, spell, and comprehend what has been read. For those with double deficit dyslexia, they also have difficulty with rapid naming, which makes it difficult for them to name things, letters, etc., which impedes fluency. Some students have both, some just one. But the purpose of this article is to debunk some common myths with also providing the correct information along the way.
Thank you so much, Roya. Thank you very much. Let's see. Winona, are you there? Would you unmute and read?
I am.
Thank you.
So am I supposed to read it the way it looks or read it how I think it's supposed to be?
Supposed to read it just like Roya did.
All right. They see the letter or word backwards. So this has been a running joke on countless Ticket. Kubetti Ticket is just around the dinner table. It is totally untrue. People with dyslexia see letters and words the Tib way, though without dyslexia. So they just take in alternate neurological route to connect this letter with the appropriate sound.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna let Heidi, can you pick up from there?
It takes them longer, and sometimes they don't allow themselves the time to process that information and guess, which makes it appear as though they are seeing a different letter. This is why allowing struggling students the time to process their answer is paramount for them to give a correct response. We have to teach them to allow themselves the processing time as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to let Carmen take over. Carmen, can you take over?
Yes. Are we in the second link?
You are in the second link. Yes.
Could you give me the first word? Sorry.
Let's see. Heidi, can you provide where you left off?
Yes, it's the one that's darkened there. If it's bold, if they read more over the summer, they
read more over the summer. I'm in the round robin where they T the letter or word Bikrit. That's the third paragraph.
Yeah.
Right. So it was a little hard to follow along, I imagine. Heidi was reading pretty quickly. Let's see if you can find your place. I'm going to call on somebody else.
Okay. Oh, hold on. If they read bore over the tubber, they would ibtrove. I have teen covent bide on the retort cured of troubling redert by well bening teacher that they to bedding to the effect of if he just read bore the tubber, he would improve hit reading.
Thank you, Sherry. I'll turn it over to David. I think David can unmute now.
So are we at to tell a line from Richard Lavoie? The kid with dyslexia is working harder than anyone else in the class. The student with dyslexia takes twice as long to read as the child without dyslexia. They do not have an intellectual deficit or motivational trouble.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Karen, can you pick up from where David left off, please?
I'm sorry, did you say Sharon?
I did.
Oops, and I Lynn tend to pay attention to someone else. Let's wait until the 3rd grade, have to have him tested. No, dyslexia is not something that is outgrown. In fact, once kids hit the 3rd grade, or even worse yet, the 4th grade, they are having significant difficulty that may be starting to affect their their emotional health. The key to helping someone with dyslexia is to have them identified as early as possible. The introduction of response to intervention is a positive step in the right direction.
Thank you,
Provided
Karen. I'm gonna thank you so much, and thank you all for your participation. I'm looking at the time and get a little concerned because I see a lot of questions in the chat, and I had a lot more content that I wanted to cover today. But I think you all get the idea. I'd love to hear from someone with the modified text, explain what it felt like to be called on. And maybe also what it felt like to hear some of your peers read so effortlessly.
It was hard to keep track of where we were.
Yeah.
It was a lot of guessing too at what the words were.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, listening to how difficult it was for the students to read, you know, I really empathized with them. I didn't have that text, and I felt for them.
Yeah, you have some empathy there. There are students in the classroom who would not react so empathetically, and likely would be frustrated or perhaps be a little unkind. Yeah,
very true. I think in a small group situation, this would be very difficult for those who saw the text in, you know, in normal letters.
Yes. Right. Thank you so much for sharing. This exercise, I mean, reading aloud, teachers do this all the time at all levels of school. It's often a way to ensure engagement, and which is all well and good, unless you have, you know, students with dyslexia, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. Let me see if I can get this to share again. Right. Forgive me there. So there's an unintended impact. Can everyone see my screen? Good. Okay. An unintended impact that schools have on the student population. No teacher means any malice. This unintended impact is the result of schools not having dyslexia awareness. Those of you who have children with dyslexia likely have firsthand knowledge of some of the social emotional impact of having dyslexia in school. Again, really, schools don't mean any harm, but lack of dyslexia awareness can cause these unintended impacts. This impact can manifest in some of the behaviors listed on this slide. Schools are rooted in text all day long. And when you struggle with reading and are interacting with peers all day through text, it can create anxiety and avoidance behaviors. The perseverance required to do the hard work of reading all day is a lot. And many students get fatigued and frustrated. When students have dyslexia and they're not told that they have dyslexia, they simply see they can't do what everyone else can do. Over time, the emotional and psychological impact can be significant on their well-being. Imagine having to maintain the stamina to persevere on tasks that you watch your peers do effortlessly. The more we know about the disability, the better place we are in to not only teach students to read and speak and deserve, but to also support them emotionally as they navigate their years in school and develop their self-awareness, their self-worth, and their self-esteem. It's a lot of hard work to learn how to read and spell with dyslexia, really hard. And it takes great emotional strength to go to school every day. Knowing you might be teased, you might be embarrassed. Students get worried and they get stressed. Because our classrooms are rooted in literacy, and I think we all understand why, but we should be celebrating these students for their perseverance, work ethic, and stamina. Understanding what dyslexia is and what it is not is essential for the children with dyslexia. They need to understand that dyslexia makes reading and writing hard, but not impossible. They need to know that they are capable and smart and valuable and full of promise. And while literacy is an essential component of school and society, it's not the only thing. When students with dyslexia understand the brain difference themselves, they often feel empowered to persevere and advocate for themselves and engage and find the multitude of areas that they can thrive.
So I'm going to take
Dyslexia
Hi,
is
coffee
critical
with
for
me.
parents.
Okay,
Schools and
and let me go do
Let me
some
see if I
personal
can-
care.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So dyslexia awareness, it's really critical for parents and schools and society, but maybe most of all for the children themselves that have dyslexia. Accommodations change the way students access content and demonstrate knowledge. For each individual, accommodations should be chosen wisely and purposefully. And not only do accommodations support students with what they need to access curriculum and demonstrate understanding, but they also support the students' emotional well-being in school. Obviously, having students read aloud in front of peers like we just did, spotlighting their difficulties with fluent reading to the world, is not good practice. There are a variety of technologies that can offer text-to-speech, from software and apps to hardware like C-pens. The accommodations listed on this slide are often supportive of students with dyslexia. Students with dyslexia require that explicit instruction to teach them how to read and spell, but they also need supports throughout the rest of the day so that they don't begin to fall behind in other subject areas that are typically also rooted in text. Like I mentioned before, students with dyslexia often have heightened abilities in other content areas, and we can't let the text demand of those subjects hold them back. Inventors of the light bulb, telephone, and airplane. Have you heard? Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and the Wright brothers, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, all had dyslexia. The dyslexic brain likely exists for a reason. Marianne Wolf, a renowned author and researcher in the field, offers this idea in her book, The Proust and the Squid, that the dyslexic brain is impacted for learning to read. But that is a relatively recent human invention. The dyslexic brain is often more creative, excellent at problem solving, sees and understands patterns differently. People with this kind of brain, one that fires more on the right than the left, are essential for the survival of our species. Brain differences are needed in a collective society. So we use words like impairment and deficit and disability, but really that applies specifically to reading and writing. Not all students with dyslexia have hypersplinter skills and talents. No, but many do. And all students with dyslexia can compete and potentially excel in many other areas in life, even in literacy. I've heard it estimated that 35% of all entrepreneurs and 40% of all self-made millionaires have dyslexia. Despite not being the quickest readers or spellers, many share some very similar gifts that make them extremely successful. Academia is rooted in text. Our world in schools is hard for students in this population because reading is all over the place and it's everything. But the world outside of school can offer people with dyslexia the opportunity they crave to do what they know they can do. Having a proper IEP for students with dyslexia is essential, not only for ensuring the appropriate instruction they require to learn to read fluently, but also for the accommodations they require to meet their potential in all content areas. It's always fun to hear a list of famous people with dyslexia, I think. So Einstein, Thomas Edison, JFK, Pablo Picasso, Richard Branson, Charles Schwab, lots of actors, Orlando Bloom, Robin Williams, Keira Knightley, Jennifer Aniston, Woody Harrelson, all have or had dyslexia. I just learned that 3 of the sharks on Shark Tank have dyslexia. Jamie Oliver, Will Smith, George W. Bush, Magic Johnson, Tom Cruise. There are many more. Harry Belafonte, Cher, John Lennon, Tony Bennett, Mozart, Jay Leno, Steven Spielberg just found out that he had dyslexia a few years ago. I like this quote from Sue Floor. She's a policymaker at British Dyslexia Association. Protecting the person with dyslexia's self-identity and self-esteem is just as important as teaching them to properly read and spell. Here are my 2 favorite resources for everything dyslexia. Please check them out if you want more information. They're bountiful resources for both parents and educators. And I see that we are out of time. I want to thank you for joining me today. I will stay on for as long as anyone allows me to answer questions. But I hope today provided you with some new understanding about dyslexia, how we can support students in school and home. I put my Twitter address here if you're interested in connecting. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for the summit evaluation. So please take a moment to answer a few questions about this session and the special education summit. Just click the link and copy and paste and it'll link the access for you have to choose session 2. And then at the top, there's a survey box where you can also switch the language if you prefer. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing my screen to get you the link.
So being that I can jump in really quick. So I have a second grader who's a twin, and we're currently in the process of doing evaluations for like ADHD, but I'm not sure if dyslexia is going to be in any part of the evaluation. So we relocated from California in last June, and I don't recall them doing any kind of screening. So is it late, or how do I go about that? Or if I just need them to just tack it on to the eval that she's getting currently for the ADHD, I'm not sure. And she had over.
This school year, MCPS is using MapRF as the dyslexia screener. So she did take that 3 times this year.
Okay.
Fall, winter, spring. They can definitely use some of that data as part of the data, but we might want to collect some more. Yeah. Yes, let's see. And
excuse me, can you repeat that? So is the school systems are conducting this dyslexic screening on their own, or do we have to request it?
you don't know. The dyslexia screener in KN1 is in place. It's the assessment we're using this school year is MapRF. We're changing to a different screener in the fall that is more sensitive and will be likely a better data source than the one we currently have. But no, you don't have to request it in K-1. It's done for all students. If your student is older than that, then request for testing would have to be, requested, at the school level. But remember, a screener only identifies risk. In KN1, it doesn't identify a disability. It just gives us some data that shows us, oh, we should provide a little bit more instruction in this area or that area.
So I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind. It's particular to my kid that we suspect that she may have a dyslexia, because all the characteristics that you mentioned, she kind of like have, and we've been struggling to communicate that with the school. And what I've been trying to figure it out, like how do we request some screening where either we rule out that she's not, or whether we make a determination that she is dyslexic. So that's what we're trying to figure out.
So if you just go to if you request it at the school level, their administration at the school, parents can request an EMT to start talking about concerns. And then it's a school group of the teachers that work with your student, plus an admin, likely maybe a special educator that might be part of that conversation. And then based on how those conversations go, the next steps happen. Maybe more intervention instruction happens. Maybe we wait and see if that works. Maybe we, so start with requesting a meeting at the school level with a team.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, I see your hands up.
Yes, I was just trying to let this gentleman know to contact the principal and to the resource teacher. Not all the parents really know who is providing services for their child. But anyway, my question is, I'm sorry, I have to close the door. Is this new and different, that the process now actually will allow for us to put down dyslexia on the IEP?
The IEP, it's still going to be specific learning disability in reading but you can put it, yes, you can put dyslexia down on the IEP now. Yes.
Okay, so that's nice progress for the last couple of years.
Right.
Way to go, Laura.
Well, that wasn't me, but it is good progress. We are definitely making progress.
Can you speak at all about why when students get up into the high school level, the reading interventions and that just kind of disappear?
Yeah. Again, I don't want to speak out of my place. I joined the team. I joined this position in August. So I'm new, and most of my work has been at the elementary level this year, but I know that secondary folks are working hard to put more appropriate interventions in place at the secondary level, but you're right, that hasn't been in place historically, but there's definitely a lot of awareness, and we know that there's a lot of need. I'm sorry if that is not a great answer to your question. It's one of the things that we're going to continue to work on for sure. I know I want to continue to work on it.
Yeah, it just seems funny that since it's well documented that dyslexia doesn't go away, that it just kind of, you get a lot of it. And I mean, this is what I've experienced with my son, is that he got a lot of intervention in elementary, a little bit less in middle school. And then now that he's going into high school, it just seems to all kind of disappear.
Right.
And yet the reading continues to get harder and harder. So the trajectory of the difficulty of reading continues to get harder, but the interventions and the help continues to decrease.
No, I hear you. And again, when I would say that most important thing is to get those accommodations in place and secured. And if your son can advocate for himself so that he has them, so that he can access that text doesn't hold him back in all these other classes. Should not have to, but I agree with you. He's probably needs continued instruction in learning to read and enhancing those skills. But outside of reading to instruction, he should have all of these supports in place so that he's not.
Yeah, well, he has all the sports and he's really good about advocating, but oftentimes the teachers kind of look at him like they have absolutely no clue. Like they have no idea what, and as you get, as he gets older and older, the more and more teachers just have absolutely no idea how dyslexia impacts your schooling.
I appreciate that, Sherry.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to work on. That's why this whole thing was like dyslexia awareness. When schools can understand it, they can do better.
Yeah.
But right now, not all schools understand it, and we need.
Well, this is a presentation that should be given to all MCPS employees.
I would love to.
Especially at the high school and middle school level.
Yeah.
Because it's much more well understood in the elementaries, but once you get older, like people have no idea what to do.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. So I all I can say is I'm working on it.
Well, thanks for your help, and thanks for this presentation. It was great.
Oh, sure. You're welcome. Andrea, you had your hand up again?
Well, I just wanted to say, sometimes as children get older, it becomes the socially, awkward thing of having to advocate for yourself. So kudos to you that you're encouraging your son to advocate for himself. But I would bet my bottom dollar that it's awkward at best for him to make himself known and his needs known to his teachers that change all the time. And I am a teacher also, but not with high school. And I am here listening to this because I think this is a big issue. But we have to figure out a way where we can allow children to advocate for themselves, so that and make them not feel like they're standing out. So because that really sets them apart in the social game.
Andrea, you're absolutely right. I've heard testimonies of, adults that talk about their school experience and that advocating for their accommodations was often humiliating and embarrassing. It's just easier not to ask than to go through that. And not everyone has the personality, to, go up to a teacher and say, hey, you know what, I need the recording of your lecture, or I need the notes from this, you need to provide me the notes so I don't have to take them in the moment. It's really uncomfortable, totally. And it's something, the more teachers are aware, though, the easier they can make it for the students to do that. But
that's another thing with, as the kids get up into high school, that the IEP rests more on their shoulders than on the teacher's shoulders, where it should continue to, that yes, they need to advocate, but also if a teacher knows that, then they shouldn't need to be asked to give the notes to a student. They should just know that's what needs to be done. But they, as you get up into the high school area, they're trying to, make the kids, independent and all that. But you're right, it is challenging. He sometimes, takes it as a badge of honor, like, I've got my, but it can be a little humiliating too.
mm-hmm. Yeah, if we can take that, schools can work to take that stigma away from that. That would help a lot. I see Haiti.
Yeah, my sons are out of school for a while already, but I was a special education chair in my schools. And there was an opportunity, 2 opportunities that were great, that we could, as adults, help the children advocate for themselves. There was a program called MELS, Montgomery Exceptional Leaders. And they were trained to do that, to tell the story, their difficulties and suggestions, that they could do that, help other students and help the teachers. And also I asked for the last day of school, when the principal at a meeting, the last time the principal met all the teachers together, I asked for time for that, just like a little bit of time. So those students and any other ones that wanted to share their experience, and they're usually the ones that were graduating that would share, and they would come and tell all the teachers what the experience was in school, going through school, and they also told their difficulties and what helped them, how the teachers helped them, and sometimes how they didn't, but mostly what they could do to help the other students that were coming along. It was a beautiful experience, since there was this student with that had dyslexia, and she also said, and she had dyslexia, learning disabilities, and she didn't speak English as a first language. So it was like accumulation. She was overloaded. She was brilliant, sweet as could be, trying to participate in anything in school, and it was so hard for her. And other students that graduated too, and they were telling where they're going to go next in their lives, but they were saying, but there are these difficulties that happen. They explained to the teachers what the difficulties were. They heard from their own mouths, just like this, what was hard, and this is how somebody helped me with. So please help the other ones, doing something like that. So we can, as adults, parents, volunteers, other teachers, we can facilitate for those situations to happen, to help other students and help the teachers. So, and that's important, that communication, it will help explain who they are, and they will bring their gifts up to other kids to see who they are. So we should use that more often. We should bring those programs, because that MELS disappeared because it got out of the budget. It needs to come back. And I hear some people talking about that the Montgomery Exceptional Leaders equivalent is being rediscovered. It's just like rediscovering the wheel again. So, and so we should do that, so that to try to bring those situations for them. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Haiti. Thank you. That's a real big part of what special education should be, is also helping students find their voice and what they can say and how they can navigate. Michelle? And
so I appreciate your presentation. It's an excellent presentation. And this is a question, two questions. One, is dyslexia more prevalent in left-handed people because they're writing in the opposite one? Second question, when you talk about interventions and everything for a timeline, how much more time do they need with specific and systematic interventions to get to a point where it becomes for them? You're talking about interventions continuing in middle school and high school, right? is there ever a time when they get to the point, children with dyslexia, where they don't need that intensive systematic or interventions, and what's the timeline? That's what I'm wondering, because for a parent perspective, they're in interventions, they're making progress in, that's what I'm asking. Is that
Great question. I don't know the answer to the left-handed question.
okay?
But the second question is, there's absolutely a time where that instruction isn't needed. But again, spectrum nature of the disorder. So there are some students with dyslexia that don't have much of a phonological core deficit. Maybe that's mild. Those students are not going to need as much instruction in the code as someone with a severe phonological code deficit. Someone with a severe deficit in that, it could take them twice, 3, 4, 5 times as long. I mean, to learn to read for a typical neurotypical reader, it's estimated that it takes 3 years for a child to learn to read. 3 years in English, not in every alphabetic language, but because English is very complex orthography, that it takes 3 years. So K1, 2. By the end of grade 2, for a neurotypical reader, we're hoping they've got the code down. They've got enough skills where they can have word attack. They start adding to their sight word vocabularies through reading, and they make that shift at that time. For someone with a severe phonological core deficit, it could take twice as long for them to do that. It could take even longer. It's a spectrum disorder, and it also depends on the efficacy of the instruction that they're getting, how often they're getting it. Is their group 20 minutes? Is their group 45 minutes? It's just, so there's no one answer. It's not like we can say, okay, by 6th grade, they should be good to go. Not for all kids. But what they do need, if they have that phonological core deficit, they need that explicit systematic cumulative instruction. It's probably, if it's severe, the deficit is severe, it's going to need to be intense. It's going to be long. I know students that are still working on the code in 7th, 8th grade. So, I mean, that, and then started with intense intervention, in the K or 1, and it's just taking that long, but they are making progress and they will get there. And when they get there, they're not going to need that anymore.
Okay. But thank you for your answer. And thank you very much for your time. It's been
Yes.
very instructive. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed my morning. And you guys are a great audience. And you can find me on Outlook, on MCPS, on the website. And then also you've got my Twitter handle. And so thank you for being here and advocating for this very special group of students. You guys enjoy this beautiful weekend.